What is Aboriginal American history? And what is Hebrew/Israelite history? Can you have one without the other? If you answered yes, you are seriously mistaken. Some people watching this documentary are either religious Israelites who believe all Black Americans originate in Northeast Africa, or so-called woke Aboriginals who have absolutely nothing to do with Torah. My goal is that both of these groups will have some type of spark in their mental recollection that previously never ignited. We are not from Africa, and Aboriginal American history is in the Torah. And what most people don't perceive is the fact that the well-known passage of Torah, known as Deuteronomy 28, is specifically about the plight of the American Aborigines since the last several centuries. Before I start, I must bring forth two major points. Firstly, it will be completely asinine to believe that all 44 million blacks in America originate from Africa. It is a well-known fact that 95% of all slaves went to South America or the Caribbean, and only 5% of all slaves sent to the Western Hemisphere went to North America. Now get this, 47% went to the Caribbeans. But the real shocker is, there are more blacks living in North America than all the Caribbean islands combined. And according to the 2017 census, the total U.S. black population is 44 million. And the total Caribbean population is also 44 million. But considering the fact that not all Caribbean people are quote-unquote black, we know that the black population of the islands are far less than 44 million. Now, how could this be if all Black Americans were brought over? Simply because we weren't. We are the first of the land. Which brings me to my next point. No one who calls themselves an Aboriginal American should do so if you don't claim or believe in Torah or any form of Hebraic study. Allow me to briefly explain. The very term Aborigine is a Hebrew term, which means first to pass over or to pass through. A bar in Hebrew is the root of Eber, which is the root of the word Hebrew itself. It means to pass over. Now, Rishoni or Rishoni means first. Therefore, Aborigine comes from Aborishoni, meaning the first to pass over. I'm sure that most of us are familiar with Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26. Basically, it is one of the most significant covenants our God made with our ancestors. A promise to our ancestors that if we lived righteously and did His Torah, we would be above all the nations of the earth in health, spirit, and wealth. What many people do not know is that at one point, Our ancestors were above all the nations of the earth. We actually traded goods and knowledge with other people on the Eastern Hemisphere, especially Africa. We also traded cultural knowledge and even scrolls. But a big lie that is propagated today is that North American Aborigines did not have any written language. However, this is a huge myth that is only believed simply because North American Aborigines were the most displaced, enslaved, and culturally stripped people in the Americas. Aboriginal American institutions were burned or destroyed, and people who built them or taught in them were wiped out. Deuteronomy 28 is also a serious warning that if we did not do His Torah, we would be beneath all the nations of the earth, a race of captives, prisoners, prey, and a spoil. And the only way to break this curse would be to turn back to the laws of the Most High. This is the thesis of the chapter, Deuteronomy 28 and 43. The stranger that is within thee shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low. Because the people who are high in the earth today, the so-called white man that is above all the earth, at one point was the lowest people in the earth dwelling in the caves. And the people who are at the bottom of society today, the so-called Negroes, at one point were literally the highest people on the planet. And the minute we went down, they went up. And the minute our ancestors fell, the white man rose. Now, what most people don't realize about Deuteronomy 28 is the fact that it is an organized chapter broken down into several sections, 7 to be exact. Disease, oppression, land ruination, theft, distribution, desperation, and confusion. All of these terribly gruesome and unfortunate events happened to our ancestors in the past and are still happening to us in present times. When you read Deuteronomy 28 with the idea of the true Holy Land being in the Americas, you will get a new understanding of the actual context of the chapter. The chapter talks about our land experiencing immense drought, turning into dust, our plants not growing, our olive trees not giving fruit to eat. Because as soon as we were cursed, our land has become cursed as well. You can look in the western area of the Americas where we originally lived and tell that that land has been through some serious damage, some serious deforestation and desertification. Not only that, but that area has a type of olive tree known as the desert olive tree, which at one point in history was used as food, but now it's not. The purplish black olives that grow from these trees have adapted to a desert climate and now do not produce as much oil as they once did. These fruits are still edible, but their taste is bitter and dry. These are the curses of land ruination. Deuteronomy 28 and 23. And the heaven that is over thy head shall be brass, and the earth that is under thee shall be iron. Verse 24. Hayah will make the rain of thy land powder and dust, from heaven it shall come down upon thee, until thou be destroyed. Verse 40. Thou shalt have olive trees throughout thy coast, but thou shalt not anoint thyself with the oil, for thine olive shall cast its fruit. Most true Hebrew tribes found in North America lived on the north and east coast, ranging from the south all the way to the northeast. There are some Hebrew tribes in California as well. But these tribes were dispersed either due to natural migration, which was caused by famine and desertification in the land, or because of the Mongol invasions from Siberia, which was prophesied to happen in Ezekiel 38 and 39. A lot of Israelite tribes that were in the southeast, however, were already there because of the Assyrian captivity, which the northern kingdom never left. If you are familiar with my channel, you know that Assyria was actually an ancient American empire which ranged from the southeast area of the United States and stretched all the way beyond the Great Lakes. And Babylon was an empire that ranged north and east of the Great Lakes. Therefore, it is obvious to conclude that not all of these people are Israelites. In fact, most of them are heathenistic people. Different tribes got dealt with differently by the oppressors. But just because not all American Aboriginals were Israelites doesn't mean they were safe from the European invaders. Numbers 24 and 24. And the ship shall come from the coast of Chittim, and shall afflict Assyria, and shall afflict Eber, and he shall also perish forever. Chittim is a Japhetic father of the Dorian and Mycenaean Greek and Roman empires in Italy, which later spread to the coast of Portugal, Spain, and Britain. This prophecy is saying that the people from Europe would send ships to Assyria and afflict them, and make Eber, also known as the Hebrews, perish forever. In the chapter of Deuteronomy 28, there are key words which hint at our land being in the Americas. For example, Deuteronomy 28 and 36, Hayah shall bring thee and thy king, which thou shalt set over thee, unto a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, and there thou shalt serve other gods, wood and stone. If our home was in the Middle East, we would know who the Europeans are, because ancient Greece was only a boat ride away from modern-day Israel. But the Europeans had to be a people that we never knew, us nor our forefathers. Verse 49, Hayah will bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. In this scripture, the Most High makes it plain and simple that the nation who he sends against us will come from the opposite end of the earth. Like I've already said, modern day Israel is not on the opposite end of the earth from the Greek and Roman Empire. They are actually neighboring locations. Verse 50, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. This scripture shows that the oppressor was very cruel and ruthless when it came to the oppression and destruction of our people. You will see more of that further on in this documentary. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull known as Doom Diversus. He authorized Alfonso V of Portugal to conquer all Saracens and pagans and non-Christians and deliver them into the hands of perpetual servitude. But this would later be applied to those of the Americas after the Moorish rule of Iberia came to an end. After the end of the Battle of Granada in 1492, hundreds of conquistadors sprang from the coast of Iberia and penetrated the old New World, with Christopher Columbus being the first. Some historians will say that white Europeans could not imperialize the old world until Moorish rule in Spain came to an end, because the Spanish and Arabic Moors were the first to lay claim upon the Americas from Europe. Hence the numerous Arabic merchants all throughout the Atlantic during that time. It is also a well-known fact that Columbus brought a Hebrew interpreter along with him by the name of Luis de Torres, because Columbus was expecting to find Israelites in the land. Not only that, but Columbus also stated that he was trying to capture the holy city of Zion in the Indies. You can read about this in the book Christopher Columbus and the Participation of the Jews by Meyer Kirsling. In an excerpt of this book we read, of sources, statements, opinions, and prophecies on the subject of the recovery of God's holy city in Mount Zion, and on the discovery and evangelization of the islands of the Indies and all the other peoples and nations, to Ferdinand and Isabella Ecteria, our Spanish rulers, only going to the Caribbean and the coast of Central America, never to find this city of Zion that he was longing for. However, he found islands full of melanated Taino, Arak, and Carib Indians, who he called Los Indios, or the people of God. But there he and his men raped the woman and took nearly 1,000 people as captives and brought them to Spain and Portugal. And they were traded along the coast of the Mediterranean and North Africa. Some were even taken as far as the Silk Road to Asia Minor. In 1493, Pope Alexander signed Intercateria, which gave Spain and Portugal authority to every area west and south of the Cape Verde Islands. In 1494, these lands of Central and South America were officially divided into conquest borders by the Treaty of Tordesillas. Spanish adopted their own version of slavery called encomienda, where captured people of the Americas were now property of Spain. However, when South America was under conquest, the goal of the Spaniards shifted from finding Zion to finding El Dorado, or the City of Gold, which many conquistadors probably considered the same thing, as in many scriptures, Jerusalem is described as a city laden with gold. These greedy bastards first heard of El Dorado from the Incas of Peru. They told them that El Dorado was a land north in the mountains. They thought it was Colombia at first. When they went there, they found gold, but not a city of it. They were still unsatisfied, so they spread abroad Central and South America. By 1520, hundreds of conquistadors stormed the Americas in authorization of Spain and Portugal. In 1521, the Spaniards under Hernan Cortez laid siege to the Aztecs and then went to the Baja California Peninsula in search of El Dorado. And by Francisco Pizarro and his men, the Incan Empire was dismantled in 1532. However, to whom of which I will focus on the most, and one of the most ruthless conquistadors in history, was Hernando de Soto, who actually worked with Pizarro at the age of 15, and just like Cortez, he decided to go to North America in search of El Dorado. However, instead of the armpit of California, he decided to go to the belly of the Gulf. He sailed from Havana, Cuba to southern Florida and immediately had hell with the Aboriginals of the land. Him and 250 men with him had a rough time getting through the thick, swampy Florida Everglades, especially the nights on horseback. But an immediate battle broke out between him and the black Florida Aboriginals upon contact. 16 of his men and 2 of his horses died within the first conflict alone, but the fatality of the Indians were higher. The arrows of the Indians were no match for the 300 Spanish bloodhounds fed on human flesh that were loosed upon the Indians during each confrontation. They normally had the power to kill entire villages. This is one of the curses of desperation. Leviticus 26 and 22. I will also send wild beasts among you, which shall rob you of your children and destroy your cattle, and make you few in number, and your highways shall be desolate. Deuteronomy 28 and 26. And thy carcass shall be meat unto all the fowls of the air, and to all the beasts of the earth, and no man shall fray them away. The Florida Indians, who fought and managed to survive De Soto's dogs, fled north and east into other territories. Deuteronomy 28 and 25. Hayah shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways before them. In the book History of Hernando de Soto in Florida by Bernardo Shipp, De Soto gives a clear description of the appearance of these Indians. Quote, there was a very large and black Indian of an aspect very different from those of the interior of North America, end quote. In an aspect different because it was already emphasized that most of the Aborigines were copper-toned instead of very black. In this book, he also mentioned how the natives of Florida would also adorn themselves in lion skin garments and build buildings so big that 300 people could live in them, which probably, of course, were the institutions which I have aforementioned, which were later destroyed by settlers. And he also mentioned the point that 6 members of his crew enslaved up to 500 Florida Indian individuals and sold them into Mexico and converted into the Catholic faith. This is an example of the curse of distribution. Deuteronomy 28 and 64. And Haya shall scatter thee among all people from one end of the earth unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. Our fathers never known anybody dying for their sins on a cross. This was new to us. Leviticus 26 and 33. And I will scatter you among the heathen, and will draw out a sword after you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. In fact, he also stated that his crew would take children from their parents, never to be seen again, and if the parents dared to fight for their children, a sword was drawn after them. This is a curse of desperation. Deuteronomy 28 and 32. Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand. De Soto also mentioned how the Florida Indians made great use of mountain bison, which he called cows, for meat and clothing. De Soto's soldiers shot and killed as many of these mountain bison as they could for 2 primary reasons. 1, to feed himself and his crew, and 2, so the Florida Aboriginals themselves wouldn't have any food to eat. Deuteronomy 28 and 31. Thine ox shall be slain before thine eyes, and thou shalt not eat thereof. We also can read in Deuteronomy 28 that our famine would get so bad and our food supply will be cut off so much that we will begin eating our children. It is a well-documented fact that many of the Aboriginal Indians of the Southeast Territory food supply got cut off by Spaniards so bad to the point where they became cannibals, feeding on their children and roasting them above fire. These curses has played out all the way into the end of the 17th century, when over 80 million mountain bison and American buffalo were completely wiped clean to cut off Indian food supply. Today, less than 100 free-roaming buffalo remain, while there at one point were more buffalo and bison in North America than people. By 1541, Hernando de Soto's men would have already enslaved and captured hundreds of Florida Indians, selling them off the coast into Cuba and mainland Mexico to be converted into Catholicism. The Indians who were sent to the islands would serve hard labor for a period of time to quote-unquote break them of their primitive savage Indian nature, and later bring them to mainland Mexico on ships to be converted to Christianity. If you are familiar with my channel, you should know by now how the original Egypt or Mizraim was in the Americas, in the general region ranging from modern Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Illinois. Thus, Deuteronomy 28 and 68 was fulfilled in a literal sense. And Haya shall bring thee into Mizraim again with ships, by the way whereof I spoke unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again, and there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Hernando de Soto and his men were documented to have carried his Indian slaves with fetters and chains and yokes about the neck in order to keep them bonded together on his journey.
Clearly came in search of slaves. They brought leg irons and collars and chains to enslave the Indians. Probably during most of the expedition, they probably had as many Indian slaves as they had members of the expedition. So at times the expeditions probably they had as many people as 800, 900 people, including all the Indian slaves that were accompanying.
This is an example of a curse of oppression. Deuteronomy 28 and 48. Therefore thou shalt serve thine enemies, which Hayah shall send against thee, in hunger, and in thirst, and in nakedness, and in want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck, until he has destroyed thee. The number one tactic Hernando de Soto used was to pull up on each village and tell them that they are now on Spanish territory, and that they are the property of the Queen and King of Spain, and that they must submit to the Catholic faith and accept Jesus Christos as their official Lord and Savior. Thus, they had to sacrifice their entire previous way of life, and if they did not want to do this, they would then either be forced in perpetual slavery or be instantly killed, depending on De Soto's mood that day.
In keeping with his charter from the king, De Soto read a lengthy statement to each group of natives he encountered. They and all their lands now belonged to the Spanish crown, he informed them. They were to pledge their allegiance to Spain and accept the Catholic faith. Should they refuse, it came with this warning. With the aid of God, we will enter your land against you with force, and will make war in every place and by every means we can and are able. We will take you and your wives and children and make them slaves, and we will take your property and will do you all the harm and evil we can.
The second and most effective tactic was simply killing the chief, which caused the entire tribe to go into a shock mode, to be more subjective to servitude.
One tactic used by De Soto was to capture the chiefs. The chiefs were not only economically and politically important, they were also the focus of their people's religious life.
It was devastating to the local populations when the Spaniards captured the chiefs because it just paralyzed everyone.
This is another example of oppression. Deuteronomy 28 and 36. Hayah shall bring thee and thy king which thou shalt set over thee unto a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, and there thou shalt serve other gods, wood and stone. The last year of his life, 1542, De Soto was the most gruesome and cruel. His hatred for the black Aboriginals had burned in his heart more than ever, and at this time, he wasn't in Florida anymore. He had made his way through Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, killing and slaughtering as many villages as he could simply out of the hatred of his heart. Him and his men would trample civilians on horses and send his bloodhounds upon an entire village in the night, killing them all. And after each village he left, he would set flame to it. But believe it or not, his battle tactics were not even the number one killer of these natives. Before the last 5 months of De Soto's life, there were 80 villages from Memphis, Tennessee to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And when he died at the end of 1542, only 5 of those villages remained. At the last 5 months of De Soto's life, De Soto happened to fall very ill, and he made contact with, either good or bad, with all 80 of these villages, and 75 of them were wiped out instantaneously. This was not because of warfare, but disease. Simple diseases such as cold and flu were new to Native Americans, but these simple viruses alone weren't enough to wipe out whole tribes. Whatever disease De Soto and his men had in the last 5 months of his life had to be something a lot more than a flu or a cold virus. It was enough to kill De Soto himself and many of his men. Some archaeologists and historians say that De Soto probably had a fever due to typhus, which was completely unknown to all Aboriginal Americans at the time. This is an example of a curse of disease. Deuteronomy 28 and 61. Also, every disease and every plague which is not written in the book of Torah, them will Hayah bring upon thee until thou be destroyed. The reason these diseases are not mentioned in Torah is because these diseases came from the other side of the earth and we were not familiar with them. Smallpox, malaria, gonorrhea, syphilis, and many more to the native population of the Americas and wiped out many people. Verse 62. And ye shall be left few in number, whereas ye were as the stars of heaven for a multitude, because you would not obey the voice of Hayah, thy God. Not only was the first waterway slave trading going on between Florida, the Caribbean, and Mexico, but it was also going on between New England and Europe as well as North Africa. In the book Africans and Native Americans by Jack D. Forbes, it states, quote, slaves from Terra Nova, Canada, showed up in the slave markets of Seville and Valencia very soon after 1500. For example, in Valencia, during the period of 1516, we find in 1503, Miguel, Mani, in 1505, Juan and Pedro, in 1507, Antonio and Juan Amarico, in 1515, Ali, now Melchor, in 1516, Catalina. They were all classified as Negroes. End quote. At least 3,000 Americans, so-called Indians, are now known to have been shipped from Europe between 1493 and 1501, with the likely total being possibly double that. Most were sent to the Seville area, where they seem to show up in slave markets as Negroes. These Indians who were sold into slavery and shipped across the sea to Europe, they were classified as Negroes. You can tell the Moors had a lot to do with the capturing of these Indians as well, due to the fact that one of the Indians was renamed Ali, which was an Arabic name. And like I've mentioned before, Arabic Moors had control over the Atlantic before the Europeans did. In that same book, we see, quote, thus even Columbus was loading 5 ships with slaves. He was proposing to sell 4,000 along various parts of the Mediterranean and along the coast of Africa. Columbus was also unconcerned that many Americans would die in the slave trade because, as he said, the blacks and native Canary Islanders, when first enslaved, also had to die in great numbers. For Columbus, the Americans were pieces, or cabezas de cabras, heads of goats, and it did not matter if only 10% lived to reach the market, according to Las Casas, who incidentally possessed Columbus's diaries, letters, and notes. The shipment of Americans to Europe and Africa by Columbus and other Spaniards was then not an accident, nor was it a result of armed resistance or alleged cannibalism. It was a direct extension of the style of commercial slavery along the practice of Genoese and the Venetians of the Mediterranean, and used by the Portuguese along the west coast of Africa. This is another example of our distribution. Deuteronomy 28 and 64. And Hayah shall scatter thee among all people from one end of the earth into another, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known. Meanwhile, in the colonies, where slavery was prominent in the 1600s, an act was passed to the indigenous tribes, the Virginia Act of 1682. The act stated, quote, Act 1. It is enacted that all servants which shall be imported to this country, whether Negroes, Moors, mulattoes, or Indians, who and whose parentage and native countries are not Christian, and at that time of their first purchased by some Christians are hereby adjudged, deemed, and taken to be slaves to all intents and purposes. In other words, after 1682, the colonies put Moors, Indians, and so-called African slaves into one and the same category as Negroes and slaves. This gave way to a whole new chain of reclassifications for Israelite Aboriginals of America, from being called Indians, to Negroes, to niggers, to colored, then back to Negroes, then to black and African American. This is an example of a curse of confusion. Deuteronomy 28 and 37, and thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb and a byword among all nations where Hayah shall lead thee. A byword, meaning being called something outside of your name, is something that the Israelite Aboriginals of the Americas had to go through from that point onward. However, this meant that in 1682 and after, all captured Indians would be kept as slaves. As soon as Europeans had established colonies in North America, they had hell with the indigenous population. There are hundreds of documented and undocumented wars between newly established colonial soldiers and black Indians since 1622. However, the first recorded instance of Indian slave revolts actually happened in 1521. Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón was a wealthy sugar planter in Hispaniola. In 1521, he dispatched Francisco Gordillo on a slaving expeditions to the Bahamas. Gordillo and another slaving ship, piloted by Pedro de Cuello, sailed northwest in search of a land rumored to be found in that direction. On June 24, 1521, they made landfall at Winyah Bay on the coast of present-day South Carolina. After some preliminary explorations of the region, they kidnapped 60 Indians and brought them back to Hispaniola. These Indians came from a territory known as San Miguel de Guadalupe in present-day South Carolina. These Indians were documented to have revolted as soon as word came out that they were to be slaves. But these Indians were forced into the slave trade anyway due to the encomienda practiced by the Spaniards. And during the Salem, Massachusetts witch trials in 1693, there was documented to have an enslaved Indian from the Barbados known as Tituba. In many books, such as The Crucible, for example, this Indian slave is also called a Negro. When a white man fought the Indians, they often took their victims and held them as prisoners of war, which were later chained up, shaved, and auctioned into slavery. In the colonies, this Indian slavery actually happened at a higher rate than African slavery did. The tactics that Europeans used against Aboriginal Americans to take them into slavery were simple. Surround the village, grab as many as you can, and the ones who fled, they killed them with either a sword or a musket rifle. For the first time in forever, these Indians had seen the blasting of gunpowder. This is a curse of oppression. Deuteronomy 28 and 22. Hayah shall smite thee with a consumption, and with a fever, and with inflammation, and with extreme burning, and with the sword, and with blasting, and with mildew, and they shall pursue thee until thou perish. During this time, the United States colonies began to set up plantations. Every plantation that was built on Indian ground. The cotton, beans, corn, and rice that the natives of the land were already growing were now forced to be grown for Europeans for profit. This same form of slavery spread to the south to Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. However, most of the slaves of Texas, especially Galveston, which was the largest slave port in Texas, were specifically taken from Cuba and other Caribbean islands after the transatlantic African slave trade was outlawed in 1808. The slaves all throughout the South were simply Indians robbed of their history, mentally, physically, and sexually abused, and forced into servitude by the Europeans on their own land, growing their own food for Europeans for their profit. This specific inconvenience is also found in Deuteronomy 28. Thou shalt betroth a wife, and another man shall lie with her. Thou shalt build an house, and thou shalt not dwell therein. Thou shalt plant a vineyard, and thou shalt not gather the grapes thereof. The fruit of thy land and all thy labors shall a nation which thou knowest not eat up. And thou shalt only be oppressed and crushed always. Thou shalt plant vineyards and dress them, but thou shalt neither drink the wine nor gather the grapes, the worm shall eat them. What you thought you knew about the transatlantic slave trade from what your teachers taught you is a bunch of lies. The only slaves in America that came directly from Africa either went to the Carolinas, Virginia, and in one case only, Alabama. During the early 1700s, New Orleans, Louisiana, became the United States' largest slave market, and by 1808, New Orleans had successfully imported over 100,000 slaves into that one city alone. And even after 1808, more slaves were being illegally imported into New Orleans. However, these slaves did not come from Africa, but from the Caribbean. Most of the slaves taken from the Caribbean and brought to New Orleans came from Haiti or Jamaica, which were both occupied mostly by Taino Indians rather than Africans. When you see New Orleans culture like the Mardi Gras festival, this is an example of Caribbean Indian culture being utilized in Louisiana, whether the people know it or not. The common scholastic narrative is that Europeans went to Africa and began kidnapping Africans. However, this is a white supremacist lie. Europeans did not just go to Africa and taking Africans off the street. It was a slave trade. Peep the term trade. Many Africans were trading their slaves with the Europeans. These people were already slaves before going into the hands of the European. And many of these slaves were simply descendants of those same slaves that were brought to the continent 100 years previous. Yes, that's right. Most of the slaves that were taken from Africa in general are simply recycled Indians from America that were sent to Africa in the early 1500s. No matter what Indian tribe these people came from, they were brought to a collective area and assimilated into other tribes during the breeding process, and then brought to another collective area and assimilated into those tribes. In other words, our tribes became shuffled up like a deck of cards. When the Most High said he would scatter us, he meant every last word. Due to the very many acts of Indian rebellion, especially the Gullah Wars, which lasted from 1739 to 1859, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830. For the next 8 years, Southeastern Indian tribes fought the soldiers. The struggle of the Seminoles against the United States government to hold on to their land resulted in the Great Seminole War. In January 1837, 10,000 American soldiers were sent to Florida, and the Seminoles were defeated. More than 250 black Seminoles, as well as Seminole prisoners, were loaded onto boats that arrived to New Orleans to await transportation to Indian Territory. Also, the Creek Indians of northern Alabama were being shipped to New Orleans starting in 1837. These Indians were literally being shipped to New Orleans, the heart of ancient Mizraim, just like Deuteronomy 28 and 68 said. The plight of the Aboriginal Americans fits so well with the prophecies that the Hebrews were to go through, and the cultures and traditions of these people before their oppression is the reason why many wealthy historians and authors documented many of the Aboriginal tribes to be synonymous to Hebrew or Israelites. Many of these Europeans actually dwelt around Indians for long periods of time and documented their specific culture, traditions, languages, and practices, and came to the conclusion that these people are indeed the lost tribes of Israel. You can find many books on this, such as The History of American Indians by James Adair, View of the Hebrews 1825 by Ethan Smith, The Greater Exodus by John Fitzgerald Lee, and An Original History of Ancient America founded upon the ruins of antiquity by George Jones, just to name a few. Here is an excerpt of Original History of Ancient America founded upon the ruins of antiquity. Not only did these Europeans recall that the Aboriginal peoples of this land were Hebrews, but they also had a firm belief that the land itself was holy ground for a long time. From the age of 6 years old, you were taught the history of pilgrims coming to America. But did your teacher ever tell you the definition of a pilgrim? Pilgrim, noun, 1. A person who journeys to a sacred place for religious reasons. 2. One who travels to a shrine or holy place as a devotee. These Europeans knew something about our land that they lied to us about, and we simply don't know. They know that this land and its people is holy. To give just one example of this knowledge, in a 1799 Thanksgiving Day sermon, Reverend Abiel Tabbitt told his congregation in Massachusetts, "It has often been remarked that the people of America come nearer to a parallel with ancient Israel than any other nation upon the globe. Hence, our American Israel is a term frequently used, and common consent allows it apt and proper." End quote.
Remnants of the lost tribes of Israel. They knew God and they rejected him. He put a curse upon them and darkened their faces and turned all men against them. And gentlemen, as Christians, it is our duty to hunt them down and slay them.